Mohammed Yunus is the founder of Grameen Bank. Grameen loans money for self-employment to over 4 million poor women in Bangladesh.
You cannot get a dollar without a dollar in your hand. In the poor people, nobody gives the first dollar to catch the next dollar.
Dr. Yunus designed Grameen to serve people who have no collateral. 5 borrowers form a group and guarantee each other's loans. The repayment rate is greater than 98%. More than half of Grameen's members have moved their families out of poverty.
We have demonstrated beyond anybody's doubt that it works and is sustainable, and it can work in all kinds of cultural and economic situations.
Grameen Bank has become a model for hundreds of microfinance programs around the world, serving tens of millions of the world's poorest citizens. In this program, Dr. Yunus shares the experience and insights gained in his struggle to build the world's leading poor people's bank.
I toyed around several alternatives. Finally, I decided maybe I should link them with the local bank. Bank is the one who should be lending money. This is their business, this is their job. So with enthusiasm, I go to the branch manager or the bank manager who is located in the campus, propose to him that he lend money to the poor people in the village. He fell from the sky. He couldn't believe I even said that. He said, no, it can't be done. It can't be done. I said, why not? Because, he said, poor people are not creditworthy. What does creditworthy mean? Creditworthy means he will not be able to pay back. I said, how do you know? Did you lend them at all? He said, no, I never lent them. So how do you know? I said, everybody knows that. Because they are poor, no matter how much money you give, they will eat and the money will be over. They can't pay you back. So I went to higher officials in the city, downtown. I talked to them. They said the same thing. So every time I go and see somebody, they tell me the same thing. And it went on for months. I couldn't find the door to open. Then I learned something from them and I used it. I said, why don't you accept me as a guarantor? I become your guarantor. I sign all your documents. Risk is on me, not on you. You give the money. I thought it's such a straightforward proposal, they will immediately go for it. They didn't. In all, there were more than 6 months. Finally, I was accepted as a guarantor. And it worked. I was very excited that it worked. But the bank manager doesn't change his mind. He said it may work in one village, but if you do it in 2 villages, it will never work. I said, okay, let me do it in 2 villages. So I did it in 2 villages, it worked. He said, well, 1 village and 2 villages are the same thing. Maybe you should do it in 5 villages. So I did it in 5 villages, it worked. But he doesn't change his mind. After I have done this several rounds, and I realized that if I do the whole world, he's not going to change his mind. Maybe I should forget about him. So I thought maybe I should have a separate bank doing exactly what I'm doing. And that idea started haunting me, that why don't I have a bank for the poor people?
Hello again, everyone. What a great example of perseverance and innovation that is with Mohammed Yunus and Grameen Bank. I hope you've had a terrific day so far. It's great to see you back here for our afternoon plenary session that echoes the conference theme, which is Igniting Capital Markets for Social Good. We've been hearing a lot all day so far about definitions and questions, cultures and measurement, risk, reward, and what we all mean when we say impact. What is impact? Luckily, our next speaker studies all of this and more. Alex Nichols is the University of Oxford's first tenured lecturer in social entrepreneurship and has pioneered much of the academic work that demonstrated the need for a strong ecosystem to help social enterprises scale their social and environmental impact. In his seminal 2008 book, Social Entrepreneurship: New Models of Sustainable Change, Alex states that social capital markets require infrastructure parallel to that of traditional capital markets, like a social Wall Street Journal, social MBAs, and a social stock exchange. I'm happy to say that in the short time since this book was published, many individuals and organizations, including IIX and Shujog, and many others sitting here, have made great strides in strengthening the structures that facilitate industry growth and maturation. It is such a pleasure to now bring Professor Alex Nichols up to the podium, where he looks forward to engaging with all of you. Alex?
Okay, good afternoon. How do you follow Mohammed Yunus? Not easy. So I've had the pleasure of introducing Yunus a few times in Oxford, but never actually coming after him. So what an anticlimax. Sorry, everybody. So thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me here and for making it possible for me to be here. It's a great pleasure to be here and to talk to you all. This is a really exciting event and a very important one, I think, in the evolution of this space. So what I was asked to do was to sort of work at a quite kind of macro level. So I think we're hearing some wonderful examples of project level, organizational level, sector level, innovation initiatives, networks being built to help this social investment space grow in Asia and beyond. But I'm going to operate at a kind of higher level, sort of just the macro level, and just give you some ideas based on my research about what, where I think this sector is going and perhaps some of its opportunities and pitfalls too. Hopefully this will work. So I'd like to begin kind of here. So let's begin with where we are globally in terms of the financial economy of the world, and whether or not you endorse this particular position. I think we know that we've had a very significant financial crisis globally, and this continues to resonate globally to this day. I won't go through this. This is the depressing part of the presentation, right? Everything is bad, the problems we're facing, but it's a depressing and challenging menu of consequences, I think, of the GFC, as it's sometimes called. And what this is doing, I think, is challenging some very basic sort of understanding of what the function of markets are in development, but also in sustaining economies more broadly. And this seems to be a positive moment, potentially, as well as a huge challenge to many people across the world. So I'd like to sort of start from this and move upwards into a more positive set of observations. And so we can see the commentary on this. Obama attacks Republican economic theory. It never worked. He would say that, wouldn't he? So politicians are behind this. There he is again. Capitalism has degenerated into a casino, says Yunus. Branson, our own Richard Branson in the United Kingdom. Capitalism has lost its way. So there's a whole kind of sense of rethinking, I think, what capitalism and financial markets are doing, how they function in society, and indeed whether they function at all effectively for investors as well as other actors around them. And so we've got, fascinating to me anyway, sort of coalition of very unlikely partners, whether it be the more kind of radical Occupy or 99% movements across the world, who are sort of wanting to shake up failing models of the economy, or it's something in the hallowed pages of the Harvard Business Review about how to fix capitalism, Porter and Kramer's famous piece from January a year ago, looking at shared value, new, more inclusive supply chains, and so on. So there's something in the air, and I think this does present a real opportunity to do a slide that my brother Jeremy stole from me this morning, those of you who saw his session, to imagine what we might see beyond the crisis. Beyond, is there a new capitalism here? And I'll try not to be too idealistic, right? Because we shouldn't underestimate the challenges in overturning or modifying or transforming a highly entrenched system. And maybe we should question whether we want to do that anyway. But let's imagine for a while. And the imagination that I think we can sort of bring to this set of challenges would be around these three topics. Now, obviously, I'm just reflecting what the organisers have already worked out. Anything beginning with I is important. So we need to have investors, individuals, and institutions. So I think in each of these topic areas, we can begin to unpack what, where our imagination, as well as some real practice, might take us in thinking of the possibilities of new capital markets and some, at least enhanced form of modern capitalism. So let's go through these in turn. So let's start with investors. And what our research is telling us really is that in social investments, I'm talking here really just about that part of the spectrum, we need to do considerable work still on segmenting the investor marketplace and not assuming there is a social investor and that's one homogenous individual. There are many, many social investors, I would argue, and they are looking for different things. Until we better understand that, we are not going to be able to design the instruments, the intermediaries, the markets that will function effectively to get capital into projects. And I think one of the ways we can begin to conceptualize these different types of investors into more clear market segments is around sort of two dimensions. One is thinking more clearly about what kind of value is being created by their investment. So this is drawing on Jared Emerson's famous blended value paradigm of the notion that all investment activity creates some combination of financial and social value, and really interrogating that to understand what value is being created. And that can help us, I think, even think of new accounting approaches to the value created. But the other part of this is the third point there, which I think is to recognize that in my experience of talking to social investors, there's an interesting thing going on. And that's for many of them, there is a separation of notions of value creation and notions of value appropriation. And what do I mean by that? I mean that in this space, it's not necessarily obviously the case that the investor accrues to him or herself all the value that their investment creates. They may very deliberately want that value to go somewhere else. Now that is pretty much the opposite of the underpinning of all conventional investment thinking, where the investor is looking to accrue value back to the owner of capital. I think by breaking those apart, we can begin to create a much more dynamic spectrum of social investment, where you're going to ask questions about how much of the value your investment creates do you wish to appropriate? Who else might you want to appropriate it? Under what circumstances? So I think there's some good questions we can ask there. To individuals, the second of the I's. And I'm kind of heartened that I've already heard this a few times in other sessions. I think social investment offers a real chance to bring a kind of democracy into investing, or into impact investing in this case, where we bring in not just the high net worths, not just the foundations, not just the people who hold big pools of capital, but mainstream retail investors in mainstream retail markets. So I think what Pradeep from London Social Stock Exchange was describing as citizens' capital. So we're seeing this with crowdfunding models, with Kiva, and so on. And I think, to me, part of the new paradigm, if we're going to get there in terms of investment and social investment, is this process of democracy. And it also happens to unlock lots of capital too. So it's not just a sort of utopian fantasy. And capital that might be more flexible, might take more kind of different risk and return paradigms compared with institutional investment and so on. And I think technology makes this more and more possible in terms of how do we allow small retail investors to access impact or social investing. So that's already happening. I think on the back of that, we can look at new localism. How can we allow retail investors to build investment vehicles for, say, a local community project? So to some degree, this is, community development finance is already doing this, but I think there's a whole lot more we can do around that in social investment. And, on the back of that, maybe we need to revisit the role of mutuals and cooperatives in finance that were at one stage, one of the dominant models of finance in the North, in developed countries, whether they're friendly societies or cooperatives, and kind of disappeared. They were demutualized, they were bought out, they were discouraged through legislation. I think there's a real opportunity there. So I think we've got a whole set of questions here, if we use our imagination, about how individuals at the retail level can play a big role in growing this space. And the third I, and in some ways, the I that maybe is the best developed so far, though we have a long way to go, is the kind of institutional piece. So how do we build market structures and market institutions to facilitate the growth of social investment on the one hand, and then perhaps what is talked about less often in these conversations, what is the role of political will and political structures in building new institutions at the policy level and also sometimes against policy. So, the market institution building piece is evolving, right? We've spoken a lot already about, is impact investing a new asset class? We could debate that all afternoon, but to some degree, I take that statement in the famous Rockefeller JP Morgan report as being as much a provocation as a statement. It's let's start thinking about whether this could be an asset class and where would that take us if we agreed it might be. And we might not agree that, but I think that's a useful conversation to have. And they've put plenty of money, and partners have also developed their own research around this kind of output of influential reports. In the UK, just to mention for a minute, we've got a growing marketplace of intermediaries, different organizations, funds, networks, and other sort of platforms that are beginning to populate some of this social investment space. This is not my slide. This is CAF's slide, I should say. Anyone from CAF in the audience? Sorry, it's your slide. It's still massively under-institutionalized. There's lots of gaps, but you're beginning to see players populate some of these spaces along a kind of risk and return model that's set out here. Here in Asia, there's significant market innovation. It would be inappropriate not to talk up our hosts, but I think rightly so, in terms of the work that Doreen and the team are doing at IAX. Crucially important in building the marketplace, and many of you will be familiar with their work, so I don't perhaps have to go over all that's on the slide, but also other people like the Asian Venture Philanthropy Network, AVPN, growing out of the EVPA, the European Venture Philanthropy Association, to really to provide a kind of a space in which Asian venture philanthropists can share best practice and build research and so on. So significant innovation in this region. I'll come back to that at the end, as I think really offering a major opportunity going forward. The research that the Shujog part of IX has been doing in terms of mapping the intermediary space and the appetite for investment, is another key part of this market building. Markets don't function without good information, and we're beginning to build baseline information at least to encourage market development, which is very significant. The political piece. Now, in the United Kingdom, some of you may know that in April of this year, Big Society Capital launched, and this is a highly political project. Not in the sense that it's owned by government, because it isn't, it's a third-party organization, but that it's the gestation process to bring it to its birth in April has been a long and highly political process. So this is a project that began under a Labour government and was brought to fruition under a coalition Conservative-led government in Britain. And I think it'll be a very significant innovation globally because of what it's trying to do, which is very briefly, it's a social investment wholesaler. So it's not providing direct investment into projects, but it's helping build the wholesale marketplace through leveraging its capital, and it will have 6, maybe 800 million pounds of capital to do that, looking to leverage probably upwards of £2 billion sterling of new investment into this space. And in a very innovative model that uses unclaimed assets that have been dormant for more than 15 years in UK high street bank accounts, using that as its capital stream through government legislation, which essentially encouraged the banks to hand it over to Big Society Capital. And we see elsewhere political will pushing forward some of this agenda. So this is work in Australia around their own social enterprise investment funds supported by government. But I also think we have to not just push policymakers, though I think we have to do that. We have to engage with policy in this space actively. But I think we also have to recognize that if we want to bring about real change in the functioning and structures of financial markets, sometimes that'll be about addressing power. And I just put this up as an example of people who are who are kind of doing this. Do any of you know Just Change in India? Hands up if you know Just Change in India. Thank you, somebody does. So this is Stana Marie Thakekara, who set up Just Change in India, particularly in southern India, and they've done a whole series of highly innovative projects around investing, particularly in the indigenous Adivasi people in the south of India, but their more recent work has been about sort of rethinking the conventions of markets in a more sort of empowering and democratic way. So just as one example, they're building a fair trade supply chain that directly connects Adivasi tea farmers in southern India with poor tea drinkers in the United Kingdom directly. So they trade directly with each other, cutting out intermediaries and setting the price that they both think is appropriate for the tea, that benefits both sides of the equation. So it's very different from, say, conventional tea markets where the price is set through a totally different mechanism. So it's saying that we don't have to abandon markets, we don't have to be sort of anti-market or sort of anti-capitalist to say that if we use our imagination, then there might be a moment for real reform here, and this is, I suppose, the more radical end of that. So the last thing I'll say is just a bit about the future, and this is a hideously oversimplified, I think, indication of where we might go, but nevertheless, let's go with it for a couple of minutes. I think there's at least 3 future scenarios for the social investment or impact investing landscape. There could be an absorption. There could be scenario 1, which is that the space kind of gets to a critical mass that's of some interest to mainstream markets, and they simply co-opt the lot. They buy out the funds that are developing. They institutionalize in their own organizations some of the innovation coming out of impact investing, and to some degree that gets sort of diluted and mixed in with more conventional investing. Now that may not be a bad thing. I'm not going to take a position on these about whether they're good or bad, but to some degree that's going to stop, I think, the kind of innovation that we're interested in at this kind of event. The second scenario is a kind of parallel institutionalization where you see impact investing continuing to grow at a slow rate in a way that we would call in England a kind of cottage industry, sort of like tapestry making in people's homes. You know, so it's fine, it's nice, but it's a kind of little thing down here, and here's all the main stuff going on up here. So it remains parallel to mainstream capital markets, but tiny and sort of largely ignored outside of its own immediate constituents. And then the kind of third, the radical scenario, I guess, would be a sort of transformation in which impact investing and social investment disrupts conventional mainstream paradigms of capital allocation. So where the kind of virus of social investment infects the whole of financial economics and market transactions and brings about significant changes that transform the entire space. Now this may sound very fanciful, but I'm not entirely sure it is, because I think if you go back 20 years and look at the beginning of the development of the SRI, the socially responsible investment marketplace, people would have been very surprised how fast that has grown and how big it has become over those 20 years. So I think it's not fanciful at all to imagine that some of the conversations we're having here about impact measurement and how we need to better account for externalities and so forth could become mainstream issues for mainstream capital allocation. And to some degree, if that happens, then the job of all you pioneers in impact investing is done, because you've transformed markets and they will no longer do harm in the way kind of Wolfgang was suggesting this morning, a kind of call to arms, right? That we shouldn't just deal with ourselves as a cottage industry, we should look to transform all investment and, as it were, not allow, I'm not quite sure how we do that yet, but not allow kind of negative investment. And I would sort of, just in conclusion, what I would say is that what I see in Asia, and that's of course an absurdly, it's a large region, right? So Asia is made up of many very different countries and regions, but nevertheless, in that space broadly, there is an appetite for innovation across all these levels, political, grassroots, market, and maybe some spaces for innovation around this stuff that don't exist in more institutionalized markets that we might find, say, in London, New York, and elsewhere. I think there's a fluidity in the development of Asian economies, which really may offer a space for radical innovation around this kind of thinking, which could see the whole critical mass of impact investing moving away from maybe a more North American or European origin into full institutionalization in places like Singapore, but also elsewhere in Asia. And that, I think, is a really exciting, albeit always challenging possibility. So I think at that point I will stop and say thank you very much.
Oh, it's always great to listen to Alex. Wants me to go back to school again. Thank you, Alex. Expanding on Professor Nichols, what he said, multilateral organizations are a vital player in this ecosystem. The Asian Development Bank has been one of our most supportive partners and has been central to social and economic development in the region since its inception in the mid-1960s. In recent years, the ADB has been quick to recognize the importance of social capital markets and has put its weight behind initiatives to contribute to the momentum on the space. Our next speaker, ADB Vice President, Mr. Stephen Groff, has been instrumental in formulating the strategic and operational objectives. VP Groff reaffirmed his belief in Asian social capital markets when he declared in a recent Straits Times article that with a continued commitment to harnessing the power of the market for social and environmental objectives, there is little doubt that Asia can become the world's social enterprise incubator. Indeed, VP Groff and the ADB has demonstrated that strengthening social capital markets is an integral pillar to their work by collaborating with Shujog and IAX. They also have been instrumental in helping us realize this forum. Without further ado, it is with great pride and honor that I present you VP Groff.
Try to get the technology organized here, if you'll bear with me for a moment. There we go. Well, thank you, Doreen. And ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be able to participate in the inaugural Regional Impact Forum on behalf of the Asian Development Bank, which is sponsoring some of the sessions at this important event. I think the fact that the forum itself was oversubscribed weeks ago really highlights the burgeoning regional and global interest in social entrepreneurship and impact investing. And I congratulate IIX for organizing this timely and stimulating program, and would like to take the opportunity to recognize several other supporters who made it possible, along with our contributions. And those include the Rockefeller Foundation, the National University of Singapore, the Singapore Tourism Board, Microsoft, SK Group, Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, Bloomberg, and the Singapore Ministry for Community, Youth, and Sports. Now, since our founding in 1966, ADB has been driven by a dedication to improving people's lives in Asia and the Pacific. Although ADB is probably best known for our support to large-scale infrastructure projects, such as the bridges and roads that we help build to connect markets and manufacturers, our role is to help developing member governments lay the foundations for sustainable and for inclusive and environmentally sustainable growth, to facilitate partnerships, and to share knowledge that allows imagination, innovation, and industry to flourish. We do this in close collaboration with a large number of partners, including the public sector, the private sector, and not-for-profit partners, using a variety of instruments, including loans, equity investments, guarantees, grants, technical assistance, and by sponsoring platforms that link regional neighbors to discuss policies and share best practice. Last year, ADB approved nearly $22 billion in financing, though we were able to mobilize even larger sums for development purposes through co-financing with others. And we are really proud to be part of Asia's rapid rise, which is considered by many to be the most successful story of economic development in recent history. National economies have expanded at an unprecedented pace, and human conditions have dramatically improved in that same period of time. Years before the Millennium Development Goal deadline of 2015, the region has already achieved targets for reducing gender disparities in primary, secondary, and tertiary education, for preventing a rise in HIV prevalence, for halting the spread of tuberculosis, and for halving the portion of people without access to safe drinking water. Between 1990 and 2009, the percentage of Asians living on less than $1.25 a day dropped dramatically from half the population in the region to less than a quarter today. Yet because of Asia's sheer size, even just 22% of people living in extreme poverty means that significant deprivation remains. Asia's growth has already also brought about another set of challenges, such as food insecurity, growing urban slums, rising inequality, natural resource depletion, and environmental degradation. Asia and the Pacific is also highly vulnerable to natural disasters. Today's volatile global economy and slowing growth in traditional export markets pose serious threats to Asia's recent gains. Rising rates of non-communicable diseases and graying populations could have serious implications for productivity and economic growth as well. But the enormity of these challenges requires more than just a public sector response, especially since aid funding is under increasing pressure as traditional donor countries tighten their belts. There is therefore a great deal of excitement, and I think an excitement that you can feel in this room and in these sessions today, around the emergence of social enterprises. By combining the heart of the aid sector with the ambitions, drive, and business acumen of entrepreneurs, social enterprises have created a powerful model for tackling social and environmental problems.